Hello, everybody, and welcome to another exciting episode of the Jack the Lad podcast. On today's episode, we've got on Professor Stanfield. Welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me, Jack. It's good to be here.
No, absolute pleasure to have you on. So I got you on the podcast because I came across you on Instagram, where I find the majority of my guests. And yeah, as soon as I saw, I can't remember which one it was. I think you were atop of a mountain. I then, scrolled through and it, day by day, and it was, weeks and then months and just a lot of days. Obviously, you ended up doing 351 days, 10 hours.
Yeah, spot on.
Yeah,
that's right.
I do my research. I do try. So I haven't really given anything away there because I haven't said actually what you did during that time. So do you want to just tell everyone, what it was that you did, how it all came about, and all that sort of stuff?
Sure. So last year, I spent the majority of the year living out of my backpack, hiking across the United States 3 times, border to border, from north to south, south to north. And so I set out on the first of the year last year with the first sunrise on January 1st, and I left Key West, Florida. That's the southernmost point of the country, and hiked up to Canada, and then along the Florida Trail and the Appalachian Trail, kind of stringing a few routes together, and then as well as the Pacific Crest Trail that's on the West Coast, and then Continental Divide Trail that follows the Rocky Mountains. And so that is the Triple Crown of hiking here. And I extended that a little bit. And so those 3 long trails, the Triple Crown trails, are what people in the long distance hiking community chase after over a lifetime, to be able to tackle all 3 trails. And I had enough time and resources that I was able to attempt to hike all of them in a calendar year and add on to those as well. And so in doing so, I hiked for a total of 8,450 miles last year and got to live out of a backpack right before I turned 30 for the whole year.
Nice. So why did you think about doing it?
Sure. So it been a progression to get to that point. And so a few years ago, I got into the long distance hiking community in general. And so I first hiked the Appalachian Trail in 2018, so 5 years ago now, and just fell in love with the community and the experience. It ended up being a really social sort of experience. And so there's about 5,000 or 6,000 people that set out to hike the length of the Appalachian Trail every year. And so I got out, and there's a ton of people that are out there. You're stopping into towns along the way. There's hostels set up all over the place. It's actually really structured. And I just had like this really fantastic sort of perspective shifting adventure, and just couldn't get enough of it. So then I hiked the Pacific Crest Trail the next year, and then spent a few years just working and saving up to be able to go out this last year and get to try to do this big thing. And so when I got into it, and this whole community of long distance hiking, there are people that are going out to do it and to have the experience. And then there's kind of like the people that are going for big stuff. And so the most popular, like, big stuff to go for is like the fastest known times of like hiking one of these trails faster than everyone's hiked before. And I'm not a super fast hiker, but I know that my endurance is pretty good from what I've experienced before in these other hikes. And so I wanted to set out to attempt something big, kind of that was in my wheelhouse. So not going fast, but being out there for a long time. And so initially I had set out to attempt to hike the most miles ever done in a calendar year before. I had one other trail I was going to tack on at the end of last year, but I got 10 months into the year, and my legs were just pretty beat up. And so I took the last couple months, I took a lot of time off and slowed down to finish up, to still be able to do the Triple Crown and still be able to do the big 3, as well as an extension of the Appalachian Trail. And so in the route that I did, the 2 of the trails already go border to border, but the Appalachian Trail is usually fully just within the states. And so I was the first person to extend that to become the first person to walk border to border on all 3 trails within a calendar year. There's about 500 people that have ever hiked all 3 trails in a lifetime, and there's about 15 that have hiked all 3 in a calendar year. And even though I fell short of my goal of hiking the most miles ever, I still got to join a pretty small company and getting to do what I've done. And so it's an interesting mix at the end of the day of success and getting to be out for a whole year, and objectively speaking, a failure and not hitting my initial goal. But it was great. Everything I wanted it to be, and a lot of success within that too.
Yeah, like you said, it's still an awesome achievement. I mean, you covered 8,451.7 miles. That's no small feat by anyone's standard. Literally anyone on Earth. It's not something to be shunned at. And so, when you're figuring all this out, and you're looking at, right, this is when I'm going to start it, and all the rest of it, how do you come up with your distances for each day, and the cost of stopping at the hostels and all the rest of it like that? How did you sort of budget and sort of time manage for the distances and whatnot?
Yeah, so a lot of that, it was really helpful. I'd had a good bit of long distance backpacking experience before, and about over half the hiking I had done before also. So I knew those trail communities and those towns and accessibility and everything. And in the past, I had hiked one new trail before, already having had experience, if that makes sense. So I'd hiked the Appalachian Trail and then the Pacific Crest Trail. So the first time, I went in pretty blind, but then after that, I figured like, oh, I think this other trail's experience will be sort of similar. And then it was. And so all of the information that's out there's a lot that's really helpful to be able to see what that sort of thing is like, as far as resupply options and town stops and accessibility to these towns and all that sort of thing. So a combination of personal experience with some of the trails, and then just knowing kind of how the system works with the others. It was easy to be able to help plan that out. And also knowing what my body was sort of capable of in the past. And so having felt what it was like to hike 25, 30, 35 miles in a day before, and to be able to expect to be able to do that. And so I knew kind of what my limit was and the most I was able to do in a day, and knew what my average needed to be. So another thing that I kind of inspired me to take on this project specifically, my initial goal was 11,000 miles for last year, which would have been an average of 30 miles a day, the year that I turned 30. So I kind of liked how those numbers worked out. But I ended up doing 30 miles a lot of the time, but then the experience kind of turned into this really social experience. And so I was planning on 30 plus miles and taking a little bit of rest here and there, but I ended up having so many friends and family members reach out along the way that I was cutting days short pretty regularly, pretty early on, just to be able to meet up with folks and get some time off and catch up with people. And so for the first leg, which was January 1st to June 7th, it was 158 days, and I ended up spending the majority of those nights indoors, because I was seeing people so frequently and being in town so frequently. The Appalachian Trail especially just has such good access to roads. I think it's on average like every 5 miles throughout that entire trail, you have road access if you wanted it. So it was pretty easy to find time to be able to meet up with people when they wanted to. But yeah, so just based on my experience with hiking before and knowing the trails, and usually it varies by trail, but it's often like somewhere between maybe 60 and 100 miles in between good town stops. And so going 30 plus miles a day, that's usually only 2 or 3 days in between towns, which is nice because that means then you're not carrying as much food. So your pack's lighter, so you can move faster, and it just kind of builds on itself a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. So you mentioned there obviously about like some of your prep and that. What sort of gear did you take with you? Did you end up sort of, shipping anything back, or, purchasing anything along the way? And what was something that you didn't take that you wish you had from the start?
Yeah, so I had my gear pretty dialed in by the time that I got out. I mixed up things a few times. I had my sister be my logistics coordinator for the year, so I had a closet at her house where all my gear was, and I had plans to switch things out a little bit seasonally. But I'd been reviewing gear for a few years for a backpacking website, so I've been able to collect stuff and get things ahead of time for the most part to be able to have different gear for different situations. And so, yeah, the main thing I was switching up while I was out there was just warm gear and cold weather gear of being out there, both like in the full heat of the summer and then also in the snow and the cold and the winter on both ends of it in January and then again a bit in December. And so I didn't change gear a ton, just 2 or 3 times. I switched out and had bigger, smaller backpacks I used, a bigger sleeping bag that I slept in. But for the most part, kind of the core gear stayed the same for the majority of the year. I had like trekking poles that got pretty beat up. I had to switch out that just got worn out. And but for the most part, my gear actually was able to last for the full year without having to replace too much of it from it just getting beat up.
So when you were you're talking obviously about the like seasonal changes and stuff like that, did you look at how you would? Was there any way of you sort of staying in nicer weather for longer if you'd have done it a certain way, or were you just this is the way I'm doing it, or is that the way that it's supposed to be done?
Yeah, totally. So that's kind of the fun of it. Is kind of the planning bit of it. At least for me, I'm a big logistics person. And so it's just like a big puzzle of where can I be that's going to be the most comfortable and the safest and everything. And then, some people have done a pretty similar route before. And so it's helpful to be able to read what other folks have done, to have expectations of which mountains are going to be passable and which are likely to be covered in snow at certain times of the year. And so starting with the Appalachian Trail and going up through there, I mean, definitely gets cold, but the elevation is like half of what it is out west with the taller mountains that are out here. And so even though it's cold, I wasn't up super far north until April or May where things are starting to melt anyway. So there was snow still lingering in places by the time I got up there. But for the most part, I had a pretty sweet weather window, which was a combination of planning and just good fortune of being out there, that I didn't hike in like active snow too much at all. And then I did have to kind of change some things up a bit. So like after I finished the first leg, I was so kind of beat up by the really steep mountains. So even though they're not as tall, the Appalachian Trail mountains are, the trail was made earlier. And so it's the grade is a lot tougher. They didn't put as many switchbacks in going up the mountains. And so that was pretty tough on my body. So I took some time off, and then it was kind of later in the season. I took about a week and a half off. So by the time I went back out west to hike the Pacific Crest Trail, I actually skipped the desert. So the first 700 miles I bypassed initially so that I wouldn't be hiking in the heat of the summer in the desert. So I started about 700 miles in and went north, and then came over and hiked south on the Continental Divide Trail, and then finished the year by going back to clean up the desert. So there was a little bit of jumping around to hit kind of the best weather windows that I could. But for the most part, I mean, being out for a whole year and going north to south across the country, there's going to be times where you're in non-ideal weather. But for the most part, I was pretty fortunate not to have anything too extreme.
Good. That's always handy. How did you record all of the miles that you covered?
Yeah, so the mapping app that I used on my phone is fantastic. I'd used it before, and it's pretty detailed about where you're going and everything. So I was able to use that about 80% of the time, probably maybe 90%. That just starting from point A to point B, and it has the exact mileage the whole way. So I started this day at this mile point and ended at this mile point. I was on trail all day, so I hiked this many miles. So that was really helpful. And then I also am pretty adamant about recording all of my stuff by hand. I carry a paper journal on trail. So every day I logged all of my statistics for the day. So I had my miles. My phone was keeping track of my step count for the day, so I could keep track of that. I love keeping track and monitoring all the statistics that go on throughout the year. So that, and then of course, like my budget stuff that I'm spending, But then I'm counting all sorts of stuff while I'm out there. So like liters of water that I drink a day, amount of times that I pee during the day. And then all this stuff at the end of the year, I'm working on right now, compiling all this data. I've done this on my previous hikes, but I just like to see the numbers and the stats like broken down by like how many miles I was hiking a day in this state versus that state, and how much water I was drinking in different parts of the country, and all those sorts of things. So in addition to keeping track of the miles just on paper in my journal, I've got all this other stuff that I've kept track of as well.
You mentioned there about your step count. What sort of steps were you averaging a day?
Yeah, so I ended up averaging somewhere between like 25 and 30 miles a day for the most part. So I guess that'd be about a 50K or so. And to do that, it was about 70,000 steps a day for the most part.
Ooh,
Yeah.
that is some serious going, isn't it? I only asked because me and my couple of my friends and my dad have signed up to a 54-mile hike in North Scotland, which is like, I would assume it's going to be very hilly. And yeah, it's a 54-mile hike race in 24 hours. So yeah, I'm trying to get some gen from a professional.
Yeah. So the most that I had hiked this year, the most that I did in a day was 45 miles. And that's, of course, that's like with a loaded pack and everything. But I had kind of found previously that if I hike really far in a day, I can go further, but I'm not going to be worth too much the next day.
Yeah.
And so in a previous hike, when I hiked the Pacific Crest Trail for the first time, the most that I had done was about 63 miles. And that took, pretty much about 23 hours. So pretty much the whole day to be able to do that. But yeah, doing it for one day, it's a one day go, and you just put the pedal to the metal and until it stops.
Oh yeah, 100%. We've already spoke about that, and we said that like we're not going to stop. We're going to just keep walking.
Yeah.
I mean, my old man's he'll hear this. He needs to get some miles in them legs because he's like 57, couple of heart attacks, so he needs to put the work in to make sure he can. But it was him that said, actually, he's like, we're not going to be stopping, are we? And I was like, I'll be able to keep up with you, so it's totally your choice. So we're hoping not to stop. Obviously, we want to come in well within the 24 hours. There is sort of aid stations and checkpoints, and we've got a chase team stuff that we've sorted out. But I'm really looking forward to it. It came out of the blue. My man just literally I think he sent me the link for it. And he's like, "Oh, what do you think?" I was like, "Oh, I've just signed up." He's like, yeah. "Oh, really?" I was like, "Yeah, cool. I fancy it," because it's all to do with the military. Like, we're all ex-military, so it's for the Army Benevolent Fund. So so it's all all for a good cause and all the rest of it, and it gives me something to aim for, really. I'm really excited about doing it. And like you say, we can be sort of pedal to the metal because the next day I haven't got to walk it again.
Yeah, right. You can burn yourself out.
Yeah, 100%. So while you're on the trail, were you doing a lot of stretching?
I set out hoping to do a lot of stretching. I hadn't in the past, and I'd gotten super tight before, and I was hoping to a lot more last year, but I ended up not doing it so much. And I'd heard pretty strong accounts from both ends of the spectrum of people that stretch a lot while they hike and people that don't. While I was early on, I was coming through Alabama, which was my second state. And so I was about a month and a half in at that point, maybe 1,500 miles or so. And there's a caretaker at a cabin at the first mountain in the Appalachian range. His name's Nimble Will Nomad. And he didn't start long distance hiking until he was 65. And in 2021, he became the oldest person ever to through hike the Appalachian Trail at 83. And so he's this old hiking legend that's done tens of thousands of miles over his life, starting way late in it. And I asked him if he stretched. And when I asked him, he stood up in his chair and started dancing around the room and said, "I've never stretched. I've got all original parts. I just go." And so I saw this person speaking from experience that had hiked way more than I had in a much older body that wasn't stretching. And they showed me how well their body still worked. So I started being a little less harsh on myself for not stretching, seeing what this guy was doing. But by the end of the year, and even now still, I'm super tight from it. So I'm not convinced that was the right thing for me not to stretch as far as I was going. Definitely in the future on future hikes, I want to work harder to make that a priority. But I was stretching daily for about the first week, and then I was just so exhausted at the ends of the days that I just called it and just took 5 extra minutes of sleep at both ends of the day.
Yeah. So when you're moving through obviously all the different states and whatnot, what was some of the highlight states, shall we say? Like, where were you like, wow, this is amazing, or even the people that you met?
Yeah, so it was it being a pretty good mix of states I'd hiked in before and states that I hadn't. But even though I'd been there before, I think the state that wowed me the most was Washington State, all the way up in the Pacific Northwest, where the weather's great. I was there in August, and the weather's still awesome. It was it's plenty warm and hot during the day, but nice and cool to sleep in at night. But it's still just the Cascade Mountain Range is just awesome. Everything's huge up there. You're in these huge mountains, and then looking off, seeing these volcanoes that are standing up there. So just these solitary peaks that are off in the distance. That really wowed me. And then a new state that I hadn't hiked in before that was also really awesome was Wyoming. So coming in through Yellowstone National Park, kind of in the northwest corner, and then entering in the state, and that was awesome. But I wasn't even the highlight of the state. Going through there, they were just the Wind River Range was unbelievable, and people were great everywhere. I think I definitely saw the most people when I was coming through, kind of where I grew up in the Southeast, where I had a lot of like high school and college friends and family members that are around that helped for me to be able to see people so often. So the region I grew up in is where I enjoyed seeing people the most. People I met and new people too that were reaching out, that were just following me online. I ended up having a surprising amount of meetups with just total strangers. Most of them were also hikers, so I could go and kind of scroll through their Instagrams a little bit and see like, oh, this person hiked the Appalachian Trail last year. Like I can definitely trust this person. But it was a good mix of people that I met before and just totally new people that were coming out to trail to help out.
What surprised you on the trail?
I think how much of the experience ended up being social, where I was, one of my big goals was to be able to go out and set this record, but kind of in the back of my head, my plan, the thing that I wanted the most was to get to spend a year doing this thing that I loved, and attaching the kind of a catchy tagline to it of going for a record just made that easier to communicate to people. Where like if everyone I met, I explained like, oh, there are these 3 long distance hiking trail in the country. I'm trying to hike all 3 of them and all this stuff. Like that's just such a mouthful to explain to people. But if I can say in just like a quick sentence, like, oh, I'm trying to hike more miles in a year than anyone's ever hiked, like people can get excited about that really quickly. And even though it's not the same reason I'm as excited about it, they can still get excited with me for it. But more than anything else, I really just wanted to be able to be outside for the year and hoped to be able to see and catch up with people a lot. And really quickly on, that became the clear priority that's what I was doing. And that's what I had the support to be able to do. And so, I think that's what surprised me is how much I was able to get that time in, how often I was having home cooked meals at people's houses and meeting up with people and just like really like in different corners of the country, people I hadn't spoken to in a decade or so, just through social media, saw what I was doing and like, oh, hey, I'm over here. You want to meet up? I can host you for the night or take you out to dinner or at least bring you into town to resupply. And so the social experience just really quickly caught on and took off. And that ended up becoming really what the hike was all about. Was all of these meetups with so many folks from all different periods of my life.
If you did it again, what would you do different?
I think I would definitely stretch more and try to take care of my body a little bit better, just be more mindful of that. By the end of the trip, especially, I I was really feeling it in my body and just dragging through, just doing what I had to get by. And I'd like for it to not have to get to that point. Um, but I think, I don't know, I'm really happy with the way that it went. I think I could have taken a little bit better care of my body, but for the most part, as far as like what I was prioritizing and everything, and even money that I spent the last couple months, anytime I had an opportunity to put myself up in a hotel, I was doing that. And so my monthly budget just about tripled by the end of the year from how much I was just trying to treat myself when I got into town, because I was getting pretty beat up. But even that, I don't even necessarily regret so much. It's what I felt like I needed to be able to kind of to get going. I think one thing that maybe I could change is my balance with my screen time on my phone. That ended up being a really interesting component of the experience that kind of led to the most joy from it, and kind of the most detracted from it the most, with just the way I was able to interact with people through social media. Like, that's how I got to meet up and have all these great social experiences. So that was awesome. But I may have leaned into it too much, getting to hotels where I needed rest, and then getting into bed. I haven't had much service the last couple of days, and staring at my phone screen for 3 or 4 hours, and being up super late, and then not getting a super great night of sleep, and getting back on trail the next morning, not being as well rested. So my body not repairing itself as well as it could have. So that kind of falls into just the self-care bit of the whole thing. But yeah, so the short answer to your question, I could have taken a little bit better care of myself, but I'm really happy with what I prioritized, and the way that it went, and with the results of it too. Even though I didn't hit my goal of all the miles, I still think the experience was just perfect.
When you started staying in hotels a lot more often, did it then make it harder in the morning to leave, to be like, right, I need to get back on the grind? Because there's quite a famous saying, I don't know who said it, about it's hard to work hard when you're getting out of silk sheets. It's something like that. I've butchered it a little bit, but it's, yeah, when you're, I think it was a boxer that said it, like, to stay hungry when you're, living comfortably. When you're on the grind, they come up, and they all come from, sort of broken homes, and it's like a rough upbringing. They say that it's hard to stay hungry when you're then, you've made it and you're getting out of silk sheets. Did that make each day harder, or did it just sort of all roll into one?
Yeah, I think definitely that made it tougher. And I think something that I learned and enjoy about through hiking and this experience in general is that it's a huge shift in your comfort threshold the entire time that you're out there. And it doesn't translate super well once you get off trail. So finishing these hikes, you want to come back and be a changed person and appreciate every little thing and being indoors all the time. But at least for me, some of that stays for sure. But overall, you kind of go back into sort of old ways there. So the most difficult parts by far of the entire year were my longer breaks. So, like, really intense comfort. Like, when I took 10 days off, I went and laid by the pool. I ate a pint of ice cream every single day for a week and a half, like, just pure luxury. It was great. But then getting back onto the trail after that 10-day stretch was one of the hardest parts of the year, just mentally. And I knew I was still going to do it, but it still was really hard. And so by the end, early on when I'm staying in hostels and everything, I'm setting my alarm for 6 a.m. I'm still hiking by 7:30, right around sunrise still. But by the end of the year, especially when the big mileage goal was gone and I just needed to finish and really had plenty of time, my daily mileage was just about cut in half. So I didn't even have to go as far during the day, but it was colder, and I was pretty ready to be done. So I was consistently calling all the hotels to get late checkouts. And stay until the very last minute, until like noon or later sometimes before I'm setting out. So I was really, really dragging my feet at the end. And it was hard. I didn't enjoy it as much while I was doing that. And I think that's a mix of like really wanting to be done and ready to be home for the holidays. And then also not being as present with it either, of being on my phone a lot and talking to family and so ready to get home. And the big flashy bit of going for this mileage goal is gone. I just need to kind of finish now, which is, still a big thing. But the drive went down a little bit, and I was treating myself more often, and that definitely made it harder overall.
obviously mentioned there about obviously the cost of that, and you tripled in your tailing months. How
Mhm.
much did this whole thing cost, if you don't mind?
No, yeah, I'm happy to share it because I think it's good to just have an idea of what this sort of thing does cost. And I haven't totally th- counted it all up yet to see exactly what it is, but somewhere in the ballpark between 15 and 20 grand for the year.
Okay.
Um, so starting out, it was about $1,000 a month to be out for food resupplies, hotel stays, um, new pairs of shoes I was going through pretty quickly. Between all these sorts of things, about $1,000 a month I could make it. Which I'd had just been living in an apartment before, so I'm not paying for a home or anything. I sold my car before I came out, so I had very few personal expenses outside of hiking. And so that's a lot cheaper than rent or anything. Even though I'm not working, it's really not too expensive when you compare it just to living in an apartment or anything.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. So you were out and about, and you were just living off your savings basically. There was no sort
Yeah,
of
yeah. So I was working as a manager of an outdoor store in Alabama for about 2 years before I set out to do this. It was a job that really just kind of fell into my lap the first week of March of 2020, right before all the COVID stuff started happening. But it ended up working out so that throughout COVID, I never missed a day of work. I had just gotten a job as a manager, and after the first week, they furloughed the entire staff except for the managers, so we stayed on to process all the online orders and everything. So during COVID, I actually had the best paying job I'd ever had throughout the entirety of it. So I was extremely fortunate to be in that position. And that also helped kind of inspire the trip itself of just having this experience, especially here in the United States of just like, wow, everything can change really quickly and people can get really heated about stuff. It's just kind of out of the blue. And so I'm young. I'm ready for a break from all of this stuff mentally. And I think while I can, before anything else changes that would prevent me from doing this, I want to get out and have this experience. But yeah, I was really fortunate to be in a place where I was able to save up and knew that I had more hiking in the future. So from the time I started, I was able to live pretty frugally, doing that to be able to save up for something big. And it was about a year that I was there before I kind of landed on this idea of this job, and then spent another year saving up with this specifically in mind.
And then while you're doing that, how how are you budgeting it? Like, how are you think it, like when you're saving up, you're like, oh, I need to get to X amount. Well, how did you get to the X amount? What were you factoring in?
Yeah, so that was really helpful to have a combination of like there's another guy that or a few other people that have done the calendar triple crown that have put out more information about their hikes and kind of what they
Right.
spent. So I was able to look at what they had done, and I knew that they for the most part to do the three trails, it's usually about 9 or 10 months, and then with me tacking on it, it was going to be a bit longer, so I'd be spending more than they spent. Um, and then comparing that to my budgets that I've had on previous hikes, so that and I knew that it was usually about $1,000 a month is what feels good for me for the amount of comforts that I go out of my way to get, and knowing there's going to be people that I stay with. That's about the sweet spot for me. But then adding on travel to that, flying across the country a few times, that factors in. And then I knew also I might get to a point where I wanted to treat myself more than I had in the past, which was the case. So I had kind of a budget. I was hoping for about 12 to 15, but then saved up about twice that much just in case, things went to where I needed a lot more than that or became a lot more expensive. And then, so I ended up spending more than I had hoped for by a little bit, but still had enough that after I finished, I didn't have to look for work right away. I could still just kind of relax and decompress a little bit.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Well, that brings us to a close for this week's episode. Do you want to give everyone your Instagram and all your social media tags?
Yeah, definitely. So for now, I'm just doing Instagram, and my Instagram account is prof underscore Carl. So PROF underscore CARL. And that right now I'm going through and all my stuff from last year's out. I did kind of like a journal entry sort of style for the entirety of last year. So like 3 to 5 days at a time. I'd post about what I'd been up to. And then now I'm going back through. There's a lot of stuff I didn't post, and just kind of reflecting on things and sharing more about the trip, and hope to have a lot more of this sort of stuff. Maybe probably not as extreme in the future, but still out adventuring indefinitely.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, my pleasure.
And you wanted to do a second episode?
Yeah, I'd love to.
Perfect. Right. Well, thank you very much for listening, everybody. And we shall see you again next week.